Assalamu alaikum and good morning everyone. The topic that I'll be discussing on today is Introduction to Clinical Trial. These will be the contents of my talk today, which will include introduction to clinical research, some of the guidelines which govern research activities, who are the parties who are involved in clinical research, and some discussion on how to write a research proposal, which would include the objectives, the methodology, patient selection, and ethical issues. This slide illustrates some of the components in the daily task of an academician. This would include clinical work, teaching, community work, administrative, and research. I would like to emphasize that research remains as one of the most fundamental activities of an academic institute and thus is put a lot of emphasis on. Clinical research has been broadly defined as medical and health research intended to produce knowledge which is valuable for understanding human disease, preventing and treating illness, and of course, promoting health. It usually involves a spectrum of studies which includes patients, clinical materials or data in populations. There are two broad types of studies. Number one is the observational studies, which essentially do not involve treatment, and it usually observes people in normal settings, and this would include examinations of medical exams, tests, or questionnaires. The other type is the interventional studies, which, as the name says, involves treatment, and this usually involves human volunteers. And what is a clinical trial? Clinical trials are a type of clinical research that studies new tests and treatments and evaluates their effects on human health outcome. The WHO defines it further by defining the people who volunteer to take part in the clinical trials, and these people would be testing medical interventions, including drugs, cells, and other biological products, surgical procedures, radiological procedures, devices, behavioral treatments, and preventive care. And of course, of note that this list is not exhaustive of all the elements studied in clinical research. There are many reasons why researchers embark on clinical research, but National Institutes of Health emphasizes that the need for clinical research is mainly to develop generalizable knowledge which will improve human health or increase the understanding of human biology. However, I would like to stress that participants or volunteers are pivotal in clinical research, and on their point of view, the advantages to participate in a clinical research would include involvement in healthcare, access to new treatments, and contribution to medical research. On a researcher point of view, the research question should have some form of clinical value, which would subsequently contribute to scientific understanding of health, prevention, treatment, and management of the disease. It should also have some social values that will benefit a community, a specific population, or even a future generation. Therefore, the research question should be important or valuable enough to justify putting subjects at risk. In addressing this risk, the research ethics guidelines have been devised to serve as an advisory, guiding, and preventive body to govern research involving human participants. And as you can see from the number of years listed here, there has been an evolution of the research ethic guidelines to be as comprehensive and as effective as possible to perform this task. The most recent research guidelines that has been utilized include the Declaration of Helsinki, Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, CIOMS, in collaboration with the World Health Organization Guidelines 1949, and the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice, ICH-GCP guidelines. There are different clinical trial models. As you can see here, there are different designs, cohort, meaning a specific study population versus a general population, perspective, which is a treatment intervention over time versus cross-sectional, i.e. looking at it at just one time point, intervention versus observational, as I mentioned earlier, different phases, meaning the different phases of a clinical trial, the early phase versus the later stage. These studies look at different outcomes, mainly looking at the diseases, looking at conditions, metabolic outcomes, including blood results and radiological results, event-driven, including complications and death, and some studies look at cost analysis or cost effectiveness. There are different phases of biomedical clinical trials. Phase 1 usually tests new drugs and usually studied first time in a small group of people. It is commonly to evaluate a safe dosage range and to identify side effects. Once the phase 1 is successful, it progresses to phase 2, which is conducted in a larger group of human subjects. And phase 3 looks at even further, even larger populations, and usually involves different regions and countries. Most commonly, phase 3 clinical trials are required before a new treatment is approved. Phase 4 clinical trials looks at even a wider population over a longer time frame, and these will identify complications which is specific to that medication. So, who are the parties involved in a clinical study or trial? This would depend on which trial you are doing. If you are conducting an investigator-initiated clinical trial, and this would generally mean that the idea and the proposal is from yourself, this will only involve a smaller group of people, and that will include yourself as the primary investigator, the patients, i.e. the participants that you will require, and of course the sponsors, which are the grant providers. However, if you are embarking on an industry-driven clinical trial, and that would mean that the idea and the proposal comes from your sponsor or a specific institution, and this therefore would include a larger group of people, and that will include the clinical research organization, the study monitors, study coordinators, and the site investigators. So for here on, I will be referring to the study regardless of if it is an investigator-initiated clinical trial or industry-driven clinical trial, because essentially they are similar. It starts off with a study protocol. In writing up a study protocol, the document should describe every step of the study, the answers relevant questions about the study topics. It should contain the rationale or justification of the study, which will describe the impact of the findings on public health. It should also state clearly the objectives, the methodology, the budget, and also the timeline. Let us start with the introduction. The introduction of the study should be able to describe the rationale and justification on the need of the study. It should also include current scientific evidence, which will therefore be able to identify the knowledge gaps and the research question that you want to answer, and also support the new hypothesis that you have in mind. The research is considered invalid if it doesn't contain the necessary justification for the study, and therefore it will become a waste of resource and also exposes the subjects to unnecessary risks. Research objectives. The aims and objectives are very commonly interchanged, and therefore let me start by saying that aims are statements of intent and usually written in broad terms and usually states the general outcome of the project, whereas objectives should be specific statements that define measurable outcomes. So therefore, research objectives should accurately reflect the study methodology. It should clearly identify the measured variables. It should be phrased in the appropriate and most relevant terminologies, and should utilize action verbs which are specific enough to be evaluated or measured. And this would include to assess, to determine, to compare, to verify, to calculate, and to describe, among some of the examples. So as you embark on the study design, you just try to bear these three principles in mind. The research design should have scientific validity, and this would include validity of the research methods with accepted principles not only for yourself as a researcher, but also for the patient that you're studying on and also for the community around you. It should have efficient statistical planning with adequate sample size. In writing the research methodology, it should include the necessary information, which as listed below. This list is of course not exhaustive but inclusive of number of subjects, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the informed consent, the randomization, the treatment arms, follow-up schedule if required and necessary, window periods again if relevant, samples that are required in the form of blood samples or just questionnaires, and of course serious adverse events if it is an interventional study. I'm just going to spend a little bit more time in describing randomized control trial, mainly because it is the only trial that puts patient at most risk. A randomized control trial, more often than not, requires a control group. But if it does, as a researcher, you need to justify if it is required or is it an appropriate control. If a placebo group is required, you need to know what is the content of the placebo and again, if it is justified to have one. If the trial requires a single or double-blinded design, will the blinding be made obvious by the efficacy and the side effects of the treatment, and of course to define what standard of care mean to a patient's treatment. In selecting subjects or participants for the study, the proposal should include clearly the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Special population requires extra consideration, and these would include pregnant mothers, adolescents, psychiatric patients, illiterate, homeless, and prisoners. These terminologies are used interchangeably. Vulnerable population include children, elderly, and handicapped. However, it is important for a researcher to consider to minimize the sampling number, and that is why a sampling calculation is required, and while maximizing the benefit to the study population. Some explanation on inclusion and exclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria very commonly requires the mention on the fact that the patients are able to read and write, and there should not be any communication language difficulties which will enable them to provide consent. The age is usually stated as well as the comorbidities and concomitant medications. If there is any exclusion criteria, this should be clearly stated as well, as these could potentially harm patients, example those with underlying medical illness, and those who are unable to provide informed consent, example psychiatric illness, as this will interfere with the validity of the study drug if these patients are not selected carefully. Some ethical issues for researchers include recruitment of patients. Researchers should ensure that there's no coercion for the investigators as they recruit patients. Patients should not feel threatened if they decline to participate, and continuation of standard treatment should be ensured for all patients who are unable to complete the study. In meeting the target number, researchers should ensure that the patients are suitable for the study instead of just considering the number and the time that they have to complete the study. In regards to the recruitment, cross-referrals from co-investigators are allowed, as well as self-referral from own clinic to research clinic. That is absolutely acceptable. Patients could also be invited through invitations through posters, brochures, leaflets, and even media. In regards to informed consent, the patient is required to provide the informed consent him or herself. However, in the event that the patient is unable to do so, the next of kin or other accompanying family members are allowed to assist. Clinical staff and research assistants are absolutely not allowed to assist in obtaining informed consent from the patient. In signing the informed consent, the researcher should ensure that the patient is literate and able to understand the informed consent provided. They should be given adequate information in regards to the purpose, the methods, the risk, the benefit, and alternatives to research if the patient declines to participate. The patient should be given ample time to understand the informed consent given. Right. Once the study has been initiated, the researchers should ensure that all study procedures are adequately documented. And this would include informed consent, whereby a copy must be provided to the patient, documentation of all procedures related to the study, any changes in terms of medications or in terms of treatment should be documented, and if necessary, all the physical examination, the vital signs, also compliance, diaries, etc., whichever is relevant. The documentation purpose is very, very important, just in the event that any queries come and any questions in regards to the study protocol arises. If you are embarking on industry-driven study, I would like to mention that the primary investigator should fully understand the study drug, the products or the devices that will be utilized in the study. The researchers should also be able to address the research risks, in which could be trivial or serious, transient or long-term, including physical, psychological, and economic impacts on the patient, and even social impacts, for example, discrimination or stigma from participating in the trial. And this is the responsibility of the researchers to ensure that everything has been done to minimize the risk to the patient. Some participants could be misled to think that they are entering a clinical trial because they will receive the treatment or intervention for sure. However, the researchers should educate or should inform the participants that there is a possibility that they might get the placebo, and if that is so, that they will be given the standard therapy nonetheless. Investigator may be misleading to encourage patients to enter a study, and therefore this should be addressed very, very carefully. Tissue specimen and genetic studies are becoming increasingly common in current clinical trials, and this would involve the collection of specimen either in the form of blood or tissue for future use, which is currently unknown. It may or may not require replications in the future. For this purpose, the researchers should ensure that subjects have full understanding of the idea of this future research, and this should remain as optional in the study protocol. So, in summary of this short discussion on the introduction of clinical research, I would like to end with these notes. Clinical research are pivotal in generation of new knowledge, because without it, we don't progress. Participants are very important to ensure the success of each clinical trial. However, the researchers must ensure that standard of care is maintained at all times. There are a lot of ethical issues surrounding these participants and volunteers, and therefore they must be addressed at all times and given top priority. And with that, thank you.